Hello friends, watch my story till end. And don't forget to subscribe. They took my kindness for weakness, but every story here proves revenge doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be real. He remembered the hum of the engine first. Low, steady, familiar. It was the kind of sound that usually meant safety, the kind of sound a father grows used to after years of being driven to doctor visits, grocery stores, or family dinners by a son who grew into a man too quickly. But that morning, the hum felt different. It vibrated with something colder, something unspoken. It filled the space between them like a warning he couldn't quite understand. He sat in the passenger seat quietly, hands folded on top of the small bag he carried. Just a few clothes, some old documents, and the faint hope of a peaceful old age. His son's profile was tight, stiff, as if carved out of stone. He didn't smile. He didn't talk much. He didn't even look at him the way a son looks at the man who raised him through hunger, sickness, storms, and long nights. Instead, he kept his eyes on the road with a blankness that felt like distance measured in miles rather than years. At first, he brushed it off. Maybe his son was tired. Maybe work had drained him. Maybe life had placed too much weight on his shoulders. Fathers always find excuses for their children, even when the truth sits in the car like a dark passenger. So he said nothing. He simply glanced out the window, watching the city blur by, thinking that soon they would reach his son's home. Warm lights, familiar smells, a chair waiting for him, maybe even a bed that didn't creak with loneliness. That is what he believed. That is what he chose to believe. But belief is fragile. And the moment the car turned down a long road he didn't recognize, something inside him tightened. It wasn't fear yet, just confusion, a quiet ripple under his ribs. He looked at the street signs, none familiar. He looked at the buildings. None belonged to the world he thought he was entering. A strange quiet fell over him, the kind that comes right before a storm reveals its teeth. His son's hands tightened around the steering wheel, knuckles pale, jaw rigid. He didn't look over, didn't explain, didn't offer comfort. It was the silence of someone forcing himself to do something he knew was wrong, but had already decided to do anyway. He whispered, barely audible, "Where are we going?" No answer. The road stretched into a long, lonely strip of concrete leading to a building that looked too plain, too still, too out of place for anything good. As they approached, the father's heart began to sink. Not fast, not dramatic, but slow, like a stone being lowered into deep water. He recognized that building. It was a shelter, a place where people came when the world had no room for them anymore. His voice cracked. "Son, why are we here?" Still nothing. The son pulled the car into a parking spot, shut off the engine, opened his door, and walked around without saying a word. He took the small bag from the father's lap with hands that no longer trembled from uncertainty. They trembled from guilt, the kind of guilt that pretends to be strength. The father stepped out slowly, his legs trembling. The cold air hit him, sharper than he expected, and he looked up at the sign of the shelter. It made his stomach twist, made his breath shallow. The bag was placed gently, too gently, on the sidewalk beside him. He was confused, scared, and trying to understand the impossible. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, voice weaker now, the words scraping out of his throat. The son didn't answer. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe silence felt easier. Maybe speaking the truth would make him see himself for what he had become. He looked at the father for the briefest moment. Eyes empty, distant, cold in a way that came not from hatred, but from a heart that had convinced itself that this was necessary. "You stay here, just for a week," he said. The words were flat, rushed, clipped. "I'll come back." A lie spoken too easily. The father opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His heart tightened with disbelief, with hurt so sharp it made the air taste metallic. He felt the world tilt slightly, not enough to fall, but enough to feel the ground shift under his feet. He reached out a hand, but the son stepped back. "It's better this way," the son muttered, as if saying it would make it true. Then he turned. He walked back to the car. He didn't look back. The engine started. The tires rolled over gravel. The distance grew, not just physical distance, but the kind that breaks something inside a man forever. The father watched as the car moved away, slow at first, then faster, then turning the corner and disappearing like a memory deliberately erased. And in that instant, the father felt something inside him crumble. Not all at once, but piece by piece, like a building collapsing in slow motion. He stood there with his bag by his feet, staring at the empty space where his son used to be. A wind blew through, cold enough to make his bones ache. It smelled of rust, of dusk, of a life beginning to fall apart. A shelter worker approached gently. "Sir, do you need help?" He didn't answer. He just stared down the road, waiting for the sound of that engine to return. It didn't. The silence stretched long and merciless, soaking into him like winter rain. Inside the shelter, they offered him a bed, a thin mattress, stiff sheets, a creaking frame. It wasn't a home. It was a place where the unwanted tried to sleep without drowning in their own thoughts. He sat on the edge of that bed for a long time, his hands resting in his lap, his bag at his feet, his heart somewhere he couldn't reach. He thought of the years he spent raising that boy, the nights he worked double shifts so his son could eat, the mornings he skipped meals so his son wouldn't feel ashamed at school, the days he walked miles to make sure his son reached class on time. He had carried that boy on his shoulders, fed him with tired hands, held him through sickness, comforted him through fear. And now he couldn't understand how a heart that once depended on him so completely could throw him away so easily. He closed his eyes and replayed the moment the car drove off over and over in his mind. Each time, the pain grew sharper. Each time, he found a new piece of himself that hurt. He wondered if he had been too strict, too soft, too poor, too tired, too everything. He blamed himself for his son's cold heart because fathers often carry guilt even when they're innocent. Outside, he heard footsteps, men coming and going, some lost, some broken, some silent. He realized he was just one more man among many who had been discarded by the people they once fed, loved, protected. The weight of that truth sat heavy on his shoulders. The first night, he lay awake listening to other men cry quietly in the dark. Their pain seeped into the air like smoke. He stared at the ceiling, wondering if his son would come back the next day. Maybe he would realize his mistake. Maybe he would return and say he was sorry. Maybe he would open the door and lift him out of that bed like a father rescues a child from a nightmare. But morning came, and the door never opened. A week passed, a month, a year, and the silence grew so loud it felt like it filled every corner of his chest. He sat near the entrance every day, watching the road for signs of a familiar car. He held on to hope with fingers trembling from age, from sadness, from the fear of being forgotten. But hope can become heavy when it stays too long. It began to hurt more to carry it than to let it go. One day, someone mentioned in passing that his son had taken the last of his father's savings and used them to buy a new apartment. The words struck him deeper than any knife, because suddenly, everything made sense. His abandonment wasn't an accident. It wasn't a moment of weakness. It wasn't a mistake. It was a decision. His son had chosen comfort over blood, convenience over loyalty, money over the father who built his life from nothing. The realization pressed against his chest like a stone, making it hard to breathe. He stopped sitting near the entrance after that, stopped checking his phone for messages that never came, stopped whispering prayers that his son would return. Instead, he sat alone, staring at nothing, letting the truth wash over him until he felt hollow. He tried to hold on to the good memories, but even those began to hurt. The image of his son running to him with open arms became a ghost. The sound of his son's laughter turned into an echo that left his heart bruised. Every memory that once warmed him now stung like a fresh wound. For weeks he felt like he couldn't move forward, like the betrayal had anchored him to the bed, to the silence, to the moment the car door closed. But one night, staring at the dim ceiling of the shelter, he whispered a promise to himself. If he could leave me there, then I must learn to stand without him. Those words were not loud. They were not strong. They were cracked, whispered through tired breath. But they were real, and real words, even broken ones, can start a new chapter. The next morning, he got up. He picked up a broom and swept the floor. He washed dishes in the shelter kitchen. He scrubbed counters. He carried boxes. All small things, all overlooked by the world, but each one slowly stitching pieces of him back together. He wasn't rebuilding out of revenge. He wasn't rebuilding to prove anyone wrong. He wasn't rebuilding for the son who abandoned him. He was rebuilding for himself. Because the man his son left behind wasn't dead. He was wounded. And wounded things can still rise. But rise into what? Into who? What future can grow from the ashes of a man thrown away by his own child? Those were the questions that lingered in his chest every night as he lay on that thin shelter mattress. But he didn't have answers yet. Only the first fragile breath of a new beginning. And beginnings, even painful ones, have power. The years that followed did not break him all at once. Pain isn't always a blade. Sometimes it is a slow, creeping cold that crawls into the bones and refuses to leave. That was what the shelter gave him. Time. Time to think. Time to ache. Time to realize that the silence left behind by his son was heavier than poverty, heavier than hunger, heavier than the cold nights that pressed against his skin like stone. Every morning, he woke to the same sounds, coughs echoing through the hall, shoes scraping against concrete, the tired breaths of men who had forgotten how to hope. He would stare at the ceiling long before sunrise, holding his old phone in his hand, even though the battery barely lasted an hour. It was a useless habit, but one he couldn't let go of. That small piece of metal carried the memory of a number that once belonged to love. He checked it again and again, as if the act itself might create a message where none existed. Nothing came. Not a call. Not a text. Not even an accidental ring meant for someone else. It was as if he had been erased, wiped clean from the only story he thought he mattered in. He watched other men speak of their families, sometimes softly, sometimes bitterly. Some waited for children who never arrived. Others cursed the names of those who abandoned them. A few still clung to hope the way drowning men hold on to floating debris. He listened, but he never shared his own story. Shame lived deep in his chest, a shame he didn't deserve but carried anyway. He felt like a man who had failed, not only as a father, but as a human being. How else could someone throw him away so easily? In the early months, hope was still alive inside him. Thin, trembling, fragile, but alive. He told himself his son would come. Maybe he needed time. Maybe he was confused. Maybe guilt would eventually shake him awake. He imagined footsteps approaching the shelter door. He imagined his son breathlessly apologizing. He imagined being taken home, not out of necessity, but love. But hope held too long becomes a wound. Each day it grew heavier until lifting it became impossible. He stopped checking his phone. He stopped sitting near the entrance. He stopped looking at every car that passed by. He stopped whispering prayers into the sheets. The truth settled over him quietly. His son was gone. Not dead, worse. Alive, thriving, choosing a life where his father didn't exist. The day he learned about the savings, the years of hard-earned money carefully set aside for old age, was the day something inside him hardened. One man in the shelter, someone who still kept in touch with people from outside, mentioned casually that the son had bought a new apartment with family money. The words sliced through him. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the realization that his son had planned the abandonment long before the drive to the shelter. He wasn't left behind. He was removed. He didn't cry that night. He didn't scream. He didn't curse. Instead, he sat on the edge of his bed staring at his hands. Hands that once fed a child, held him, protected him. Hands that gave everything and received nothing in return. For the first time, he wondered why love can fail so quietly. Why a child can grow in a father's arms, yet grow away from him entirely. He survived the days through work, small tasks that the world ignored but kept his soul from collapsing. He swept the floors with slow, deliberate strokes. He cleaned toilets no one else wanted to touch. He washed dishes until his fingers pruned. In those tasks, he found something he hadn't had in a long time, a sense of direction. Even if that direction pointed nowhere, at least it wasn't backwards. Sometimes, late at night, Memories stabbed through the darkness. The day he taught his son to ride a bike. The night he stayed awake, tending to a fever. The mornings he walked miles to get him to school. Memories used to warm him. Now, they left him hollow. They reminded him that the boy he raised had become a man who valued convenience over compassion, wealth over loyalty, comfort over kinship. He asked himself the same questions every night. How does a heart change like that? What poisoned it? Was it greed? Was it pride? Or was it simply the belief that his father had outlived his usefulness? But slowly, painfully, a shift began. Not in his circumstances, those stayed harsh and unkind, but within himself. He began to accept that waiting was a different kind of prison. Waiting tied him to a version of his son that no longer existed. And so he let the hope die, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. Hope was killing him more slowly than hunger ever could. When he stopped waiting, the world around him grew clearer. The shelter didn't feel like a grave anymore. It felt like a dark tunnel with a distant exit he hadn't noticed before. He began saving coins, literal coins, from every tiny job he took. Quarters, dollars, tips for men too tired to cook for themselves. He tucked them away like seeds, like promises for a future he didn't yet understand. In the kitchen, he discovered a forgotten part of himself. He started cooking with leftovers, vegetables that others threw away, scraps of meat, spices donated by restaurants. Using those scraps, he made meals that smelled like comfort. The men in the shelter recognized something familiar in the warmth of his food. They said it reminded them of home. Those words filled him more than any meal could. For the first time since the shelter door closed behind him, he felt a flicker of worth. Something inside him, buried under betrayal and silence, began to stir. A tender strength, a fragile sense of self, a whisper that said he was not finished yet. Every morning, he walked out of the shelter with a tool in hand, a broom, a rag, a bucket, and purpose swelling quietly in his chest. The purpose wasn't grand. It wasn't loud. It wasn't for anyone to see. It was for him, the man he used to be, the man he had forgotten in his grief. He wasn't rebuilding to be taken back by his son. He wasn't rebuilding to prove anything to anyone. He was rebuilding because even discarded things can be repaired. He was rebuilding because survival is its own kind of rebellion. And little by little, the man life tried to crush began to stand taller. The years inside the silence were bitter. They took everything from him, even parts of himself he thought were permanent. They made him question every sacrifice he ever made. They hollowed out his pride and left his heart raw. But those same years carved a new truth into him, a truth sharper than any betrayal. Sometimes the people you love most do not break you because they hate you. They break you because they never learn how to love anyone but themselves. And sometimes, the only way to survive is to rise from the place they left you. But how does a man rise when everything has been taken? What does he build when the past is burned to ash? What future waits for someone who has lost everything, even his name in his own son's mouth? Those answers would come later, slowly, painfully, unexpectedly. But they began here, in the cold, quiet years inside the shelter. Years that did not destroy him, but forge him into someone strong enough to face the world again. He did not rise suddenly. There was no dramatic moment when light burst through the darkness or when life shifted in an instant. His rise was slower, built on tired hands, worn shoes, scraped knuckles, and mornings that began before the sun. It started with small acts, simple tasks, things most people would overlook. But to him, each step was a quiet rebellion, a refusal to remain the man his son abandoned. The kitchen became the first place where he felt alive again. He wasn't extraordinary. He didn't see himself as talented, but cooking had always been an instinct, a memory from a life before the shelter. He began preparing meals not because anyone asked him to, but because hunger surrounded him everywhere. The shelter lacked warmth, and he knew warmth could start in a pot, in a pan, in the scent of food drifting through the hallways. He began with scraps, vegetables close to spoiling, rice shared from donations, leftover chicken bones simmered long enough to pull out flavor. The first time he cooked for everyone, Men lined up with disbelief in their eyes. They weren't used to kindness in the form of a meal. But as the steam rose and the aroma spread, the disbelief softened. One by one, they tasted, and each bite carried something they hadn't felt in years, a sense of being cared for. Someone clapped him on the back that day and said, "You've got a gift, old man." He didn't believe it at the time, but it planted a seed. The shelter director noticed the change. He saw how men who once barely lifted their heads now waited at the kitchen door during meal hours. He saw how fights decreased, how conversations grew warmer, how a simple pot of food could calm an entire room of wounded souls. One evening, the director approached him with an offer, a small weekly wage in exchange for cooking every day. It wasn't much, but when the envelope touched his hands, he felt something unfamiliar, a renewed sense of dignity. For a long time, he had been surviving. Now he was contributing. And contributions are the first bricks of any rebuild. With the little he earned, he saved. Coins at first, then bills. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, a tiny pile of money began to form. Enough to feel real, enough to feel like possibility. He still lived in the shelter, still slept on that thin mattress, but inside him, space began to open. A space where dreams could breathe. One afternoon, while carrying boxes of ingredients into the kitchen, he overheard two volunteers talking about a small food stall for rent just a few streets away. It was nothing impressive, barely big enough to hold two people at once, with peeling paint and rust on the shutters. But the moment he heard the words food stall, something inside him tightened. A memory surfaced. Years ago, when his son was still small, he used to dream about owning a stall. Something simple, something honest. A place of his own where he could sell the dishes he made with heart. That dream had died somewhere between poverty and survival. But now, maybe it hadn't fully died. Maybe it was only sleeping. He went to see the stall. The owner laughed when he asked about the rent. "It's not much," the man said. "Nobody wants this thing. No foot traffic. No fancy sign. It's basically useless." But he looked at the stall the way starving men look at crumbs. He saw not what it was, but what it could become. A place where he could stand upright. A place where he could earn without relying on the pity of others. A place that wasn't a shelter bed or a forgotten corner. It took weeks to gather the courage, but eventually, he walked to the owner and paid the first month's rent. The keys felt heavy in his hand. Heavy with fear, heavy with hope. When he opened the stall for the first time, dust rose in the sunlight like memories shaken loose. The walls were chipped, the counter was cracked, and the air smelled of abandonment. But he had lived in worse. He had risen from worse. And this stall would be no different. He cleaned it from sunrise until night. He repainted the walls, hammered loose boards, scrubbed with steel wool until his hands burned. Volunteers from the shelter helped after hours, moved by the quiet determination in his eyes. They brought tools, old pots, and used utensils, even a second-hand stove someone no longer needed. When the stall was finally ready, he stood in front of it with tears pressing behind his eyes. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't modern. But it was his, a place built not from money or comfort, but from the ashes of a life torn apart. The first day he opened, only 3 customers stopped by. They didn't expect much, just a cheap meal. But the moment they tasted his food, their expressions changed. Flavor has a way of telling a story, and his food told stories of struggle, of loss, of love, of survival. Word spread slowly at first. A few customers became 5. 5 became 10. 10 became a crowd. People began returning daily, some saying his dishes reminded them of home, others saying his flavors carried comfort they couldn't name. He worked tirelessly, cutting vegetables, washing dishes, cooking until the heat blurred his vision. But he didn't complain. Every ache, every sore muscle, every drop of sweat reminded him that he was building something with his own hands. Months passed. His savings grew. The stall became known for its honesty, its warmth, its taste. One evening, a businessman who frequently visited pulled him aside. "You're wasting talent in this little box," he said. "Have you ever thought about opening a real place?" He didn't know how to respond. A real place? Him? The abandoned father from the shelter? The thought felt impossible. Yet the businessman wasn't joking. He saw something genuine in the man's cooking, something the city needed more of. The man offered a small loan, nothing suffocating, nothing exploitative, just enough to help him take the next step. He hesitated for days, pacing the shelter hallways, afraid of dreaming too big. But the mirror kept showing him a man who had survived too much to stay small forever. So he took the chance. The transition from a stall to a small cafe was terrifying. He chose a modest space, just 6 tables, a faded awning, and enough room for one stove and one fridge. The opening day felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure if he'd fall or fly. But the moment the first customer walked in, something clicked. The cafe filled faster than he expected. People recognized the flavors from the stall, brought friends, shared pictures online, praised his kindness, his cooking, his story, though he never shared the full story. Some truths are too painful to display like decorations. Weeks turned into months, and the cafe grew into a name people whispered to visitors. "You have to eat there." His income increased. He hired people from the shelter, giving them the chance he once needed. Men who had lost their way found purpose behind his counter, behind his stove, beside his tables. He wasn't just rebuilding himself anymore. He was rebuilding others. And that, more than anything, made him feel whole. But fate has a way of recognizing the strong. When a local food blogger stumbled into the cafe and wrote a glowing review, everything changed. Lines formed outside the door. His dishes appeared on social media feeds. Soon, a local news station interviewed him. His face shy, his voice soft, his story summarized politely without touching the real wounds underneath. Within a year, the cafe grew into a full restaurant, a place with warm lights, polished tables, a team of people who believed in him, a place filled with laughter, chatter, clinking glasses, and the sound of life. Rich, full, vibrant. Sometimes he stood at the doorway during closing hours, staring at the glowing interior and wondering how he had made it here. How a man thrown away like trash had become someone customers greeted warmly, someone employees respected, someone the city admired. And yet, inside him, there was always a quiet ache, a space shaped like the son who had abandoned him. Success did not erase betrayal. Money did not mend wounds. Praise did not replace family. He had built a new life from nothing, but the scar of his past still lived beneath the surface. He never spoke of his son. He never sought revenge. He never wished suffering on him. He simply moved forward, step by painful step, into a life that belonged to him again. But life is unpredictable. The same fate that broke him once was preparing to test him again. Because one night, years after being left at that shelter, he would walk outside his restaurant and find a familiar figure collapsed on the ground. The son who once abandoned him. The son who stole everything. The son who walked away without looking back. Now lying at his doorstep, starving, trembling, beaten by the very world he chose over his father. And when he saw him there, one question echoed louder than all the rest. After rising from the ashes, what does a man do when the past comes crawling home? The night was quiet when he stepped outside after closing. The street was washed in soft yellow from the lamps overhead, the air cool enough to carry the faint scent of rain. He had just finished locking the main entrance when something, a sound, a breath, a stirring, made him pause. At first, he thought it was a stray animal curled near the wall. A dark shape, unmoving, small against the building's shadow. But as he stepped closer, the truth began to form, cruel and unmistakable. A man lay slumped on the ground, thin, disheveled, wrapped in clothes that barely held together. His body looked like it had surrendered long before his spirit had. He froze. Even under the dim streetlight, he recognized the shape of that jaw, the line of that nose, the curve of that cheek that once pressed against his shoulder when fear chased a little boy through the night. Recognition hit him like a weight dropped from the sky. His son, the same son who had driven him to the shelter without looking back. The same son who had taken his savings and built a life of comfort. The same son who had erased him from existence. now lying at his doorstep, trembling, barely conscious. For a moment, his heart forgot how to beat. He stood motionless, breath caught between shock and a pain he thought he had buried years ago. Time folded in on itself, past and present colliding in a way that almost knocked him off balance. He knelt slowly, careful as if approaching a wounded animal. He could hear the boy, the man, breathing in shallow, broken gasps. His cheeks were sunken, his lips cracked, his hands cold enough to numb his own palms when he lifted them. Why are you here?" he whispered, though the question wasn't meant to be answered. It lived in the space between them, fragile and trembling. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder. The body flinched at the touch, then relaxed, as if recognizing the warmth instinctively. The father felt a sting in his chest, so deep it nearly brought him to tears. Why did his heart still soften for someone who had shattered it? But blood remembers, and love, no matter how wounded, has a strange way of breathing again when faced with the broken remains of what it once protected. With effort, he helped his son sit up. The young man's eyes flickered open, hollow, lifeless, yet carrying a sorrow so heavy it made the father's breath shudder. Those once proud eyes looked lost, frightened, desperate. When recognition bloomed in them, it wasn't pride he saw. It was shame. "Baba," the son croaked, voice cracking like glass under strain. The word hit him harder than any betrayal ever had. He hadn't heard that word in years. It had once been a melody. Then it became a memory. Now it returned as a broken whisper from a man who had run out of places to fall. He helped him to his feet, supporting him with arms that had cooked, cleaned, built, risen. Arms that should have forgotten the weight of this grown son, but somehow remembered it perfectly. Inside the restaurant, he laid him on a bench, fetched water, warmed broth, and held the spoon to his son's mouth like he had done when the boy was a child sick with fever. Each movement tore at him, both painful and familiar. He didn't speak. The silence between them held every unanswered question. When the young man finally swallowed enough to regain a fraction of strength, his eyes filled, not with defiance, not with pride, but with the helpless grief of someone who had finally crashed into the consequences of his own choices. "I lost everything," he whispered, voice trembling. "The apartment, the job, my friends, everything. I had nowhere left to go." The father listened, standing still, arms folded across a chest that felt too tight. He didn't interrupt. He didn't soothe. He simply let the truth spill out, truth wrapped in regret, in fear, in long overdue humility. I thought I was doing the right thing back then." The son continued, words tumbling now. "I was overwhelmed. I thought you were too much responsibility. And I was selfish. So selfish. I thought life would get easier without you." The father closed his eyes briefly. The words were knives, but knives he had expected, knives he had grown stronger than. The son's voice cracked again. "But life didn't get easier. It got worse. I made mistakes, got into debt. People left. Everything I tried fell apart. And every time something failed, your face came back to me. I remember the way you looked when I drove away, the way you stood there. I remember it every night." His voice broke entirely. "I've been punished, Baba. I promise you. I've been punished more than you'll ever know." The father leaned against the counter, gripping its edge as if the wood could steady him. The confession burned through the quiet room like a storm gathering force. Punished. The son believed he had been punished. Maybe he had. Maybe life had shown him the truth too late. But punishment alone doesn't heal. Punishment doesn't erase what was done. Punishment doesn't rebuild what was broken. Slowly, the father approached him. The son flinched, not from fear, but from guilt, from the weight of expecting anger. Instead, the father sat beside him, close enough to feel his shivering. "Why come to me?" he asked softly, the words trembling in his throat. The son swallowed hard. "Because you were the only person I ever had, and I destroyed it. I pushed you away, and life pushed me further. I didn't know where else to go." A tear slipped down the father's cheek before he could stop it. He didn't wipe it away. He let it fall. After years of holding everything in, the release felt almost foreign. My door was open, the father said quietly. But you closed it. I know. I know. I'm sorry. The apology trembled with sincerity, with desperation, with the rawness of a man stripped of everything but remorse. Silence settled again. Not the cruel silence of abandonment. A different silence. Heavier. Human. Honest. The father rose and fetched a blanket, draping it over his son's shoulders. Then he gave him a pillow and guided him to lie down on a long cushioned bench. The young man sank into it like a person who had been walking through storms for years and had finally found dry ground. But forgiveness is not the same as acceptance. And acceptance is not the same as trust. Trust, once broken, takes time. Tommy wasn't sure they had. Tommy wasn't sure he was willing to give. He sat down across from his son and watched him fall asleep. Exhausted, starving, emptied of pride. He studied the face that once belonged to the little boy who clung to his legs when loud noises scared him. The boy who used to laugh freely. The boy who once saw him as the center of the world. That boy had died somewhere along the path to adulthood. What remained now was a man bruised by life, shaped by consequences he created with his own hands. He didn't feel victory. He didn't feel satisfaction. This wasn't revenge. It never had been. He felt something quieter, something bitter and tender at once. Life had done what he could never do. Life had taught his son the lesson he had once begged him to understand. You cannot throw away the people who raised you and expect the world to hold you gently. The son stirred in his sleep and murmured, "Baba, don't leave me." The father looked away, his throat tightening. He wasn't leaving. He wasn't embracing him either. He was simply there, present, silent, searching inside himself for the smallest flicker of strength to face the coming morning. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know if forgiveness was possible. He didn't know how to rebuild trust that had been burned to ash. But he knew one truth, a truth he learned through years of suffering. Some wounds require time. Some truths require space. And some relationships must be rebuilt one breath at a time, slowly, painfully, without rushing the fragile edges. He rose, walked to the door of the restaurant, and turned off the final light. As darkness wrapped around him, he let out a long, shaky breath. He had been abandoned once. He had survived. He had risen. And now, standing on the edge of a new chapter he never asked for, he whispered to the emptiness, "What do I owe a son who destroyed me and returned broken by the world?" The answer didn't come. But sometimes, the most haunting stories end not with answers, but with the painful truth that tomorrow is unwritten. In the end, life does not ask who was right, nor who was wrong. It only reveals what we chose to become. When the people we loved the most walked away, a father who was abandoned rose again, not because he wanted revenge, but because survival demanded it. He rebuilt himself piece by painful piece, in kitchens no one saw, with hands the world forgot, inside nights that had no witnesses. Years later, the same road that stole everything from him returned something broken to his door, a son shattered by the very world he once chose. Over blood, over loyalty, over love. Some call that justice. Some call it fate. But perhaps it is simply the universe balancing a story that should never have been written in the first place. Tonight, a father and son breathe under the same roof again, not as enemies, not as family, but as two wounded souls standing at the edge of a truth they can no longer run from. There is no clean forgiveness here, no simple ending, only the slow, painful work of healing, the kind that begins in silence and takes a lifetime to understand. Because sometimes the harshest revenge isn't what you do to someone, it's what life does when you walk away from the hands that once carried you through the dark. And now, their story rests in the thin space between what was lost and what might still be rebuilt. Whatever comes next will no longer be written in anger, but in the fragile hope that even broken people can find their way home.